I've been studying. Let me tell you what I found. Some other verses which come to bear on this subject. What do you know? People have really noticed this issue. Loading my software. Another verse besides John 12 is John 19. Wait for it. All right, I'm going to show some of these verses that come to bear on this. Let's see. Okay. So we have in John 12 here that Mary pours spices on his feet. He says, "Leave her alone, against the day of my burying hath she kept this." So that suggests that burial perfumes and oils and spices perhaps had been previously bought, anticipating the death of Christ. After all, he said he was going to die, although most of the narratives that demonstrate their lack of belief in what he had been telling them, but it also demonstrates that he was telling them. But yet, Mark 16, and when the Sabbath was passed, the women had bought sweet spices in the King James that might come and anoint him. Now, if he died on Friday, when would they have bought this? Because they wouldn't buy it on the Sabbath. But if Jesus died right before Sabbath and they went there the next morning, what are the options? When would they have bought the spices? This is where it gets interesting. So let me share that screen. Let's start with that one, maybe. Notice this in Luke 23. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. Okay, that's interesting. That's Luke 23:56. Okay. Let me do this. Switch it like this. On the screen. Okay. Maybe that's too small. Way too small. Okay, this is John Gill's Bible commentary on Mark. Here's what this is. Let's listen to what he says. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go to the other one first because it's less interesting. Matthew Henry, if I can find it here. In this chapter, we have a short account of the resurrection. The women at the sepulchre. And when the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene, let's see. Never was there such a Sabbath. So this is just the text. And then he comments, never was there such a Sabbath since the Sabbath was first instituted as this was, which the first words of this chapter tell us was now past. During all the Sabbath, our Lord Jesus lay in the grave. It was to him a Sabbath of rest, but a silent Sabbath. It was to his disciples a melancholy Sabbath, spent in tears and fears. Never were the Sabbath services in the temple such an abomination to God, though they had been often so as they were now, when the chief priests who presided in them had their hands full of blood, the blood of Christ. Well, this Sabbath is over, and the first day of the week is the first day of a new world. Notice this. The affectionate visit which the good women that had attended Christ now made it to his sepulchre, not a superstitious one, but a pious one. They set out from their lodgings very early in the morning, at break of day or sooner. But either they had a long walk or they met with some hindrance, so that it was sun rising by the time they got to the sepulchre. The had bought sweet spices too, and came not only to bedew the dead body with their tears. Nothing could more renew their grief than this, but to perfume his body with their spices. Nicodemus had bought a very large quantity of dry spices, myrrh and aloes, which served to dry the wounds and to dry up the blood, which I showed you, the first verse I showed you, if I recall. Or maybe I didn't. I'll read this one real quick. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. So he points out that from this verse in John, Nicodemus had bought myrrh and aloes, according to John 19:39. But notice this. He mentions that. But these good women did not think that enough. They bought spices, perhaps of another kind, some perfumed oils to anoint him. The respect which others have shown to Christ's name should not hinder us from showing our respect to it. So there's a suggestion. So they're saying, even though there's all these texts that suggest there was pre-bought burial materials. Still, because of Mark 16, these good women did not think that enough. Now let's look at John Gill's commentary, which is the most interesting so far I've seen. Okay. John Gill's exposition, the Bible, Mark 16. Okay, now notice this. Regarding Mark, the first verse, when the Sabbath was passed, he says, in the end of it, as Matthew says, and I'll read Matthew 28:1, because it's another one that can apply to this issue. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and others, Mary went to look at the tomb. Okay, it's just another synoptic passage that with less detail. But not when it was the Sabbath, as the Arabic version reads, for it was not lawful to buy spices and anoint with on the Sabbath day. So they certainly didn't buy it on the Sabbath, according to John Gill, which obviously is the case. Regarding the statement, had bought sweet spices, or brought, as the Vulgate Latin and all the Oriental versions read, for though the women might have bought some on the preparation day, the day before the Sabbath, the same evening that Christ was buried, yet they might buy more for the same purpose after the Sabbath was over. Notice this. For this there was a particular market at Jerusalem, for we are told that there were there 3 markets, one by another, in the first of which were sold all kinds of precious things, silks and embroidered work, in the second various kinds of fruits and herbs, and in the third all kinds of spices. That they might come to anoint him with those sweet spices, as was the manner of the Jews. Hence we read of the spices of the dead, which were used to expel an ungrateful savor. This they did out of affection to Christ, but seemed to have no faith in his resurrection, though he had told them of it, which they had forgot. The Vulgate Latin reads, that they might anoint Jesus. The Ethiopic version, anoint his body. But the Arabic thus, anoint the sepulchre, his body being anointed before and wound up by Joseph and Nicodemus. And therefore they came to strew the sepulchre with spices and ointments and give it a sweet perfume. Though it seems most likely that they came to anoint the body, for this was one of the things which was customary in Israel to do to dead men, as Maimonides observes. They anoint him with various sorts of spices. So this market thing, that's from Jekis Ha-Abat. I don't know what that is. I'll have to look it up. It's a Jewish thing, that it's some sort of Jewish writing, I guess. But apparently at that time period, there were three, the quote is this, there was three markets, one by another, in the first of which were sold all kinds of precious things, silks, embroidered work, in the second various kinds of fruits and herbs, and in the third all kinds of spices. I don't have that. I can look up that. Again, Luke 23, see what that says. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. Interesting. That seems out of place, doesn't it? It's the verse. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the command. How does that work? How can they? Let's see. It's a weird timeline. Anyways, I thought that was interesting. See you next for part 4 when I find out something more interesting. Are these guys just assuming it's Friday and then giving their explanation accordingly? Could be. Not saying anything proves anything. I thought that was interesting about the market. I guess they're positing that as after sundown on what we could say was Saturday. But is that a presumption? I can't be sure. I'll let you know what I find out.